So I am the Reverend Dr. Francis Toni Draper, the CEO and publisher of the 130-year-old Afro-American newspapers and the senior pastor of the Freedom Temple Church here in South Baltimore. And today we are highlighting my family, the Murphy family. There are many major biographical facts about the Murphy family. I think the most significant is that John Henry Murphy Sr., long time ago in 1892, 130 years ago, had the audacity, when supposedly less than 2% of the African American population could read, to start a newspaper. And it was already called the Afro. He purchased it for $200 at an auction. He purchased the name and a printing press with $200 that either was borrowed or given to him by his wife, Martha Elizabeth Murphy. They had 10 children. He was a former sergeant, an enslaved man in the Civil War, in the colored troops of the Civil War, and he was 52 years old when he started this business. And so the lifespan of African Americans at the time was not that long, but yet he thought that people who looked like him needed to have good news, and there was nowhere that was reporting the news about our community. And so John Henry Murphy Sr. started that paper, as I've already said, in 1892. And as his sons became older, he incorporated them into the business, and they each had a job to do. He nominated, or rather drafted, or whatever way you want to call it, my grandfather Carl, who was teaching German at the time at Howard University, to come and run the paper. And so John died in 1922, but here's what he said to his sons before he died. He said, "I have a job for each of you in this family business, and you have 5 sisters. They don't have to work, but you have to pay them the same thing every week that you pay yourselves." And so in 1922, when John died, my grandfather Carl, as I said, stopped teaching at Howard, came to do the paper full time alongside of his brothers. And so that was the beginning of family members, generation after generation, coming to work for the family business. And I am 4th generation now, and we have 5th generation and 6th generation family members there. So my grandfather Carl, who was the first African American chair of what was then called the Board of Trustees of Morgan College, and also a graduate of Howard, a graduate of Harvard, really felt that education was the key to liberation. And so all 5 of his daughters went to college to study journalism, 1 to an HBCU, to Howard, the other 4 to Big Ten colleges because they wanted to study journalism. The one who went to Howard didn't study journalism, but the other 4 did. And the state of Maryland would not admit them to the University of Maryland, so they paid for them to go out of town. So education was very, very, very important. When we were young, Carl Murphy, who built a house in Morgan Park, and I already said he was chair of the Board of Trustees, he'd walk us over to the campus. There were 16 of us, 16 grandchildren, and every Saturday he would say, "This is Morgan College." It wasn't Morgan University then, and this is where you're going to school. Well, 10 of the 16 actually did go to Morgan, and so Morgan was important to us. College was important. So all 16 of us were graduated from college, as were our mothers, and we pursued, however, different career paths. Our mothers went to journalism school and went to the family business. We went and studied all kinds of things, and so there are 4 or 5 doctors in different professions, lawyers and business people, clergy people are in our family as well. But all of us, when we were in school, worked at the Afro. Carl Murphy believed if you could walk, you could write. If you could talk, you could write. So he paid you 50 cents an hour to get the story done. So in my family, I've talked about the educational pursuits, but I want to talk about we're talking about the Murphy family, but I don't want to leave out my father's side of the family, the Wood family, for Francis Marion Wood. So I'm named for my mother, Frances. I'm also named for my grandfather on my father's side, Francis. And Francis Marion Wood, because we were talking about education and inspirations for careers and those type of things. He was the first Black director of what they called colored schools in Baltimore City. So he was recruited, a PhD out of Kentucky, and he was recruited to come here in 1925 to lead up the colored schools of Baltimore. He wanted to be a superintendent, but the environment really did not allow that. He wanted to be an assistant superintendent. In fact, I read someplace that he had to sit in the back of the boardroom during school board meetings. But he changed the trajectory of public education for blacks here in Baltimore. For example, schools were known by numbers. He made sure they were known by names. And so my grandparents on both sides of the family, Murphy side and the Wood side, influenced my career trajectory, if you will. So I went into education. I taught school for a while on the middle school level and the high school level. I've done a lot of things. I've been a stockbroker, been at the paper a couple of times. I have, I'm trying to think what else. It's just so many different things. So I also, I guess I should say this in full transparency, I like school. So some people bowl and some people do other things. I go to school sometimes when it's something I want to pursue or when it fits in with a career that I want to pursue. And so you heard that I was graduated from Morgan, and then I left Morgan, and then I went to Hopkins for a master's degree, and I did University of Baltimore for a degree, master's degree in business, and Loyola for pastoral counseling. So I hung that shingle up, when I first accepted my call into ministry. And then I did a doctorate of ministry. So education and school, it's in our blood. I like to learn, lifelong learner, and you never know too much. So the Afro-American was and still is the voice of Black Baltimore, and indeed, I believe the voice of Black America. Nielsen did a survey back in 2014, and the Afro came out as #1 and was named the Black Media Authority. And so you really have to go back to 1827 when the first Black newspaper was founded by Samuel Cornish and John Russwurm. And what they said in 1827 was, we wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. And so the Afro and other Black newspapers across the country, and there are only about 220 of them left in the entire United States, still are pleading the cause for African Americans. You don't have to do something wrong to get on the front page of the Afro. You don't have to commit a crime to get into the Afro. We tell the good news of our community. Yes, we tell the news of the day, but we will also tell the news of your daughter playing basketball or your son excelling in school. We'll tell the stories of the church, and we'll tell the stories of the social groups. And so the Black press, the Black-owned press, I want to make a distinction because there are some people who do Black news, but it's not Black-owned. So the Black-owned press really is crucial. Even in 2022, the news is still important. The methodology has changed. Yes, we still have a print product like the one that I'm holding in my hand that we did for Black History Month, where we focused on the few and the first. So we still do a print product. We do our legacy product, but most of what we do is either through social or on afro.com. And we say that for less than the cost of an Uber Eats, you can get a digital subscription to the Afro. And so we're very active on social. So it's important, so we want people to follow us and like us. We have almost 750,000 followers on Facebook and 12,000 or more on IG and Twitter and, LinkedIn. And so it's important to get our news out. If not, people will continue to portray us in ways that are not complimentary to us. So some of the major challenges that we as a family, the Murphy family, had to overcome to make our contributions were the same challenges other people in the community had to overcome, except for sometimes it was magnified because of the paper. And so during the J. Edgar Hoover days, members of our family were accused of being communists because they wanted to shut our voices. They didn't want us to report some of the things we were reporting. Yes, we did report the good news, but we also reported the things that were happening to us in the community. We reported the lynchings, for example, not from the perspective of another Black person lynched, as awful as that is, but we talked to the family, to the moms, and talked to them about what that meant. And so being persecuted by your government, that's one thing you had to overcome. Just being in the spotlight is another thing you have to overcome as a family. So there are things that you have to just overcome as Black people in America. And I can't imagine how my ancestors 100 years ago even, navigated all that they had to navigate. So faith in the Murphy family was strong. So my great grandfather was the organist of Bethel Church. And so you'll see a plaque that says Benjamin Murphy there. My grandfather they all went to Bethel AME Church at one time, except for one of my aunts went down the street to St. James Episcopal Church, and all the family ended up going there. My grandfather was not but 5'2", and he had a very commanding presence. But what people don't know, he also had a very spiritual side. He was a prolific writer of prayers. So he wrote prayers for everything. He wrote them on the back of napkins. He wrote them on the back of envelopes. And so I have a collection of about 150 of his prayers. I remember one, he said, "Dear God, please tell Mr. Eisenhower that we're not his people, that we belong to you." So he wrote prayers. And I share the prayers now with the staff of the Afro, because we start all of our staff meetings. We meet twice a week. We used to meet 3 times a week at the height of the pandemic. And so I share those prayers with them. And the prayers are wonderful. And so even if you look around my house now, you'll see some of Carl Murphy's prayers. Let me say this about all of our ancestors, all of our heritage. It's important to know your heritage. You might not be the Murphy family. All right, we had a newspaper, we had a medium, but every single family has a heritage, and we need to pass it down to legacy. If you don't know where you've been, you don't know where you're going. And so we've got to tell these stories. And we had an advantage, I think, because we had a company and we were in the business of storytelling. And so we wrote down the stories, right? And so my grandfather wrote stories. I have files now where I have a folder like this that says who's buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery from the 1700s and what they did. I mean, I have that in my possession. I have a book here, and several of them. When you came into our house, you signed your name. And so we have books of who visited. And so it's just important to keep a history. And sometimes people think, well, it's not important. It is important. It is very, very, very important to do that, because our young people need to see family life the way it was and the way it can be, not just what they see on television or even out of their front door sometimes. And so we made it as a people with so much less. And we need to tell the story, what's the song say, of how we got over. We have to tell the story of how we made it through. And so we are in the business at the Afro of chronicling history. I'm going to tell you this last little anecdote about chronicling history. So we found recently a big reel-to-reel tape, and it was a conversation between Thurgood Marshall and my grandfather. Now, none of us had heard it before, and this was recently, and so we had it transcribed, had it digitized. And Carl Murphy and Thurgood Marshall are talking about the Brown versus Board of Education brief. They're talking about the NAACP and how they rally around certain things with this Brown versus Board of Education case that desegregated schools. And Thurgood Marshall says to my grandfather, he says, the boys of the press, talking about the white press, they're after me to tell them what's going on with the case. He said, I'm not going to tell them, but for you, I have a story. And so now we have that. We wouldn't have had that. I have letters from between Booker T. Washington and my great-grandfather, John Murphy Sr. And in one of those letters dated 1909, Booker T. Washington says to John Murphy Sr., "Thank you for the kind words that you said about my book, The Story of a Negro." He says, "I wish that at some time you would say something about the need for teaching our own history in the public schools of Baltimore City." That is 1909. And it's signed Booker T. Washington on Tuskegee stationery. So things like that are worth it. I found my grandparents' love letters when he was a professor at Howard and she a student. Now, he said they didn't do any, they didn't date or anything until after she was graduated. So I took those handwritten love letters and I wrote a book called No Ordinary Hookup. We have to keep our history so we can pass it along. So when I sit in the Carl J. Murphy Auditorium at Morgan, one thing that I feel is a sense of awe and responsibility. So Carl Murphy, as I said, was the first African American chair of the Board of Trustees. I served on that same board for 25 years as vice chair most recently, up until 2020. So when I sit in that auditorium and I remember when the first auditorium was built, and in one of those Saturday visits, he would take us over there as it was being constructed and tell us, because he was a great patron of the arts, and he was a German professor, so we had to listen to German opera, but he would tell us that, one day German opera would be played through the halls of the Murphy Auditorium. He really wanted young people to understand about the arts. And so you feel a sense of pride, yes, but you also feel a sense of responsibility, and you feel a sense of gratitude for those who sacrificed so there could be a Murphy Auditorium. I'm Dr. Frances Murphy Draper, better known as Toni, and this is the Murphy family.